Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our press conference. We are sitting here in the Kassensaal of the Austrian Central Bank. With me is Governor Robert Holzmann. And to our press conference, I also a very warm welcome to Mr. Jeffrey Franks, the Mission Chief of the International Monetary Fund. Jeffrey Franks is with us from Washington, D.C., I assume. Welcome, Mr. Franks.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much. We proceed as follows. Mr. Holzmann, the governor of the Austrian Central Bank, will start with a presentation, will have his remarks, and afterwards I would like to ask you, Frank, with your sort of comments on the concluding statement on this year's consultation. Okay?
Thank you.
Best. Mr. Holzmann, Mr. Governor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goodlater. Ladies and gentlemen from the press, I would like to start this press conference with reminding you a little bit on the background of this concluding statements of the Article 4 consultation. Austria is a member of the IMF, and part of this membership includes an periodic, in the Austrian case, annual review of its economic affairs. For this reason, an Article 4 mission team typically physically comes to Austria in order to talk to members of research institutions, public institutions like the Minister of Finance or other ministries relevant, with academics from different universities, and with other experts deemed necessary and useful to talk to. They assemble data, and then what they come up with is a report which will be finalized in due course. And in addition to this report, typically there are also a number of papers attached which focus on specific items which have been designed in common. So what we hear today, it's the concluding statement, which is a kind of a summary of all the findings which are there. And we would like to thank, and I would like to thank Jeffrey and his team for, again, a very, very good cooperative event what we had. This time it wasn't possible to do it physically, which we both regret, but working with Skype and WebEx and other instruments have become so common to us that it is seamlessly possible to achieve great results. And what his mission has found, what we have exchanged about, Jeffrey Sachs, the mission chief, is talking out about now. And with this, I would like to hand over to Jeffrey for his summary statement and pointing out his main conclusion. Jeffrey, over to you.
Thank you very much, Governor. It's been a pleasure to engage with your staff and representatives from the government and the private sector and others. We've had an excellent collaboration from our counterparts in Austria, as usual. As the governor said, we're presenting the preliminary conclusions of our mission. We will then write a more detailed report, which will be taken to the IMF Executive Board in August, and then the report and the accompanying research will be published at that time. The Austrian economy went into the pandemic crisis from a very good position. Growth was relatively robust in the previous years. Unemployment had been declining. The financial sector had become much stronger than it had been in the global financial crisis, and the fiscal deficit was in balance or even in slight surplus. That gave Austria a great position to start from. Of course, the pandemic hit very hard. It was particularly difficult for economic activity in Austria due to the relatively large share of the tourism industry, which was one of the most affected industries in Austria. And that led to a decline of GDP of 6.3% in 2020. As we are emerging from the acute phase of the pandemic in 2021, as you know, there were still significant lockdowns and winter tourism was significantly affected in 2021 in the first few months. But we still expect to see recovery of economic growth in this year to around 3.5%. After that, in 2022, we also expect another recovery year with growth in excess of 4%. And that will bring Austria back to its pre-crisis level of economic activity. This recovery in 2021 and 22, notwithstanding the fact that it has a growth of 3.5% and over 4% respectively, is still somewhat weaker than what we see in some other European countries. That is in part because of the nature of Austrian economic activity, but it also represents an opportunity to perhaps do a bit more to boost the economy in this recovery phase. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The fiscal balance turned sharply negative in 2020 to nearly 9% of GDP. And we expect the fiscal deficit in 2021 to be around 6.5% of GDP. We're more optimistic in that respect than the government. But we do not see this as a serious problem for Austria. While the debt to GDP ratio did jump in 2020 and will rise again in 2021. Over the medium term, as the pandemic support measures are gradually reversed, we expect the fiscal balance to return to a deficit of less than 1% of GDP, and we expect the debt to GDP ratio to resume its decline. And so we don't see a major fiscal problem brewing as a result of the additional spending from the pandemic. We do not see a need, therefore, also for major consolidation efforts in the coming years. Just the reversal of the support measures in their due time will bring the fiscal balance closer to equilibrium. The fiscal support that was provided in 2020 and is being provided in 2021 was strong, and we think it was well calibrated for the needs of the country. There was significant support for households, to the unemployed, and to maintaining workers in jobs through the short-time work schemes. There was also significant support for businesses through loan guarantees, loan moratoria, and direct financial support, particularly to small and medium enterprises and to those most affected. This support, emergency support, totaled around 13% of GDP. And as I said before, we think it was appropriate and well calibrated. We also found that the authorities were good at adjusting the administrative access to these facilities if they found any difficulties. Again, something that's very positive here. Going into 2021, some of these support measures have been extended due to the extension of the crisis itself. And that also is something that we strongly support. We would support continuing emergency measures as long as they are needed and until the pandemic, acute phase of the pandemic is past. Looking forward, the authorities have also put into place via the recovery plan that they have and the 2021 budget, a number of measures to help the country emerge from the crisis. We are supportive of these measures, particularly the fact that they concentrate in areas like digitalization and greening of the economy. We think that is the right way to go moving forward. However, we do think that there is room for perhaps an additional push to those measures and some additional spending to boost growth even further, but also to set the stage for higher growth in the medium term by strategic investments in capital and labor markets that can that can generate higher growth in the medium term and reduce the so-called scarring that happens after recessions. In particular, we think that additional revenue or additional spending could be dedicated to targeted hiring subsidies for young workers, disadvantaged workers, for support schemes to boost equity in private firms, and for more resources to encourage the thermal conversion of buildings and the transition to emissions-free transport on the green side. Finally, we also support measures that were included in the government's original plan to continue to cut income taxes in the coming years for the lower segments of the population, to provide an support for equity as well as for additional consumption going on. Let me go briefly a bit more deeply into the labor market area. We see that there are signs in the Austrian economy of a growing mismatch between the skills that unemployed people possess and the needs of businesses. And that's why additional measures on training and education could also be envisaged to help address those mismatches and get workers into a position where they can actually take the jobs that for where there are vacancies. There might also be a case for some support for relocation assistance, because there are disequilibria between the unemployment rates in some parts of Austria and in other parts of Austria, and helping people move to the areas where there's higher labor demand could also be of support. Turning to more detail about the green transformation of the economy. As I said, we're very supportive of the measures that the government envisages in its recovery plan. And we think that additional spending on the areas of thermal conversion and clean transport could be advantageous. We would also advocate a gradual implementation of carbon pricing schemes, perhaps beginning at around 25 euros per metric ton, and then gradually ramping up over time to around 100 euros per metric ton in the medium to long term. This, combined with the increased energy efficiency measures in the thermal conversion side and measures on increasing the greenness of transport, could bring Austria much closer to its own climate objectives in terms of reducing the emission of greenhouse gases. We think that resources that are raised from this kind of a carbon pricing scheme could be used for three purposes. First, compensate those who might be affected by these higher carbon prices. This include the lower income segments of the population and those that perhaps live in rural areas and have to travel more because of their physical location. The second thing that these resources could be used for would be to finance additional investment in green technologies, in green measures, as I mentioned before. And finally, there could be room from a carbon pricing scheme to cut taxes in other areas to leave the overall tax burden in Austria where it is today, that we don't see a need to increase the overall tax burden. We also would advocate a move towards green budgeting mechanisms in the government, which could help identify exactly how different budgetary measures affect the climate in a much more detailed way. Turning to the issue of digitalization, we believe that a step up in digitalization is essential for Austria in order to compete and retain its competitive advantage in the medium and long term. By some indicators, on some measures, Austria does relatively well in digitalization, but on a number of measures, Austria actually lags behind the EU average in areas like digital connectivity, the use of internet services, and integration of digital technology. It also underperforms in the take-up rates on broadband and other digital services. So we would suggest that additional resources be dedicated to this as part of the recovery package to bring Austria up to speed. This could be combined with additional training and digitalization and digital skills to close the skills gap in that area as well. Austria should be one of the leaders at the EU level and not merely at the EU average in this technology. And that will help build growth potential going forward. Finally, let me remark on the structural side, the challenges of population aging. The challenges of population aging remain important for the medium and long term. While Austria's pension system is currently financially healthy and past reforms have helped raise the effective retirement age, it remains quite low. And so measures to increase the labor force participation of relatively older workers and continue to raise the effective retirement age would be helpful for economic growth, but also helpful for the long-term sustainability of the pension scheme. Let me turn now to some issues related to the financial and corporate sectors. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, emergency support policies for the corporate sector were an important component of the rescue package that the government put together. And that has been very helpful, not just in sustaining businesses, but also in making sure that there weren't negative spillovers from corporate bankruptcies into the financial sector. The short-term work scheme had a similar positive effect on the financial sector by sustaining the incomes of workers who might otherwise have been unemployed and have defaulted on their loans. While all these measures have been good, it has brought with it a sharp increase in the indebtedness of non-financial corporations. And that indebtedness comes on top of an already existing imbalance between equity in firms and debt in firms. So we would recommend measures be taken to deal with this debt inequity imbalance. There are a number of ways that this could be addressed. We would like to see private sector led but government supported schemes that might be able to pump equity and quasi-equity into firms in a way that would retain the discipline of the market, but allow them to begin to reduce this imbalance. These could be things like partial guarantees for quasi-equity loans or partial investment guarantees for private investors investing in firms in particular sectors, which could then be phased out over time as the imbalance is reduced. Complementing these measures that would address this short-term need could be steps such as a notional tax deduction for equity to change the tax bias that's in favor of debt that currently exists in Austria and in most other countries. So combining sort of medium and long-term strategy with some short-term support measures could address this imbalance and leave the corporate sector in a much better position to invest and grow in the future. As I mentioned at the beginning, the financial sector went into this crisis in very good position. Overall health of the banking sector was strong. Non-performing loans were relatively low and capital ratios were high. And fortunately, due to the strong support provided, we have not seen a major increase in non-performing loans so far in the pandemic crisis. And we have seen profitability in aggregate remain positive, although at lower levels than previously. We've also seen capitalization levels remaining strong. Banks have built up provisioning against the possibility of higher defaults in the future, and that is appropriate. And there has been a rise in loans classified as stage 2 under IFRS, which means that those are loans that are potentially risky and could perhaps move into a default state in the future. We hope that with proactive measures between banks and their clients, we can avoid a major increase there. But banks will need to remain vigilant, and the supervisors will also need to remain vigilant to make sure that we don't build up problems in the future. Another area where vigilance is required is in the housing sector, where prices have continued to rise, particularly in urban areas during the pandemic, notwithstanding the sharp decline in economic activity. And that leads to an increase in the National Bank's overvaluation index, which suggests that we might be building up problems in the future. Current guidelines from the Financial Market Stability Board to limit the loan-to-value ratios or the income levels for certain levels of lending are not fully being respected. And so we would recommend that the Financial Market Stability Board consider making those limits more binding going forward to avoid overheating in the real estate market, which could cause problems in the financial sector in the future. The authorities in the FMA and in the National Bank continue to strengthen their banking supervision and regulation. The failure of two small banks in 2019 and 2020 did not cause any systemic problems for the banking system, but they did point up areas where we could have further strengthening happening. A working group was formed to look at the lessons from these episodes, and what the recommendations of that working group are now available, and we strongly support them and urge the authorities to implement those recommendations fully as soon as possible, including with, in some cases, new legislation which will be required. The deposit guarantee scheme paid out efficiently in the failures of these two small banks and showed the robust ability to protect small depositors. However, the decision of the Raiffeisen sector to withdraw from the existing scheme with other banks that they had participated in could introduce some potential inefficiencies in the system. We do not think overall protection of depositors will be weakened by this measure, but it will probably make the system more complicated and less efficient. With those remarks, I will conclude and open it up to any questions or comments, but first turn it back to you, Governor Holzmann.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for this great overview of the topics you have detected. We had very interesting discussions in deepening items, what you mentioned. I would like to take out, I think, your guidance on issues of digitalization and also green finance have been very useful in order to highlight what are the areas where we should put more emphasis on. And I do hope to say that the Austrian government will read your report very thoroughly in order to take up one or the other proposal. The other part of it, I think you mentioned it with regards to the financial sector. We appreciate and we agree with your statement that the Austrian financial sector is sound and well equipped to deal with the upcoming challenges there. But as always, everything can be improved, and your comments on how the experiences from the recent banking issues can be improved are very valuable. And last but not least, when it comes to the question of balance, macroeconomic balance, what to do in order to make the recovery sustainable. Yes, to say we appreciate that you see the Austrian economy coming back, and as we have discussed our recent results there, I have to say even more optimistic or even more taking account of more recent estimations about the growth part. And what you mentioned there, I think it's critical that in order to make the growth development stronger, a lot of inputs and work needs to be done at the labor market, where we see on the one hand a high demand, but also individuals looking for a job, but have not found the right employer because the skills are not adequate. And your suggestions how to address it are very much welcome. So with this few additions or remembrance of what you have been saying, I think I can hand it back to Mr. Gudlederer in order to guide the discussion. Back to you, Mr. Gudlederer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Governor. Thank you, both gentlemen, for your presentations. But before we start sort of the Q&A session, I would like to raise the attention for you. We have the concluding statement, the preliminary concluding statement in this minutes on both websites, the websites of the Monetary Fund and the Austrian Central Bank. So both gentlemen are ready to answer your questions. So please, the colleagues of the media, raise your hands and you will be online because we will open your mic. Okay, I can't see any raised hand so far. So this can mean that we have sort of answered all questions in abundance, Mr. Franks, Mr. Governor. Okay.
Jeffrey, you'd find a very critical question towards us, which would then raise the interest of journalists to follow up on it. So what is your most nastiest question you can ask me in order to get the interest of the journalist?
I think we've had a very cordial relation so far, so I don't have any particularly nasty questions to ask. And we've had long discussions, of course, with the central bank staff and had most of our questions addressed. So.
And it's Mr. Thomas Karabacek from the Austrian sort of news agency, APA. Thomas, please.
Can you hear me? No.
Yes, we can.
Very well.
Great, sorry, because it says mute. I'm sorry, I have a problem lifting my hand electronically. I do easier in real life. I have actually two questions to Mr. Frank. One of them, it strikes me that you say there are no special measures needed to bring back the economy to a normal scale, to come back to old levels, that just running down the additional measures will be enough. Could you sort of elaborate in which time path and how this can happen, that the additional money that Austria will have to pay back in the next years, where that will come from if there are no additional savings measures taken? And maybe, because interconnected with that question, what do you think is the single most important measure Austria will have to take care of first? Because of course the means are limited. You can't do all the good things you have proposed simultaneously. Where do you think Austria should start and put its money first?
Those are both excellent questions. Let me address the first one, and I'll distinguish. When I talked about no additional measures needed to get back to where we were before, I was talking about the fiscal balance, not the growth path. The growth path is where we think that additional spending would be advantageous to help reduce the gap between the pre-crisis growth trend and what we currently see. That's common in all countries when there are recessions, that sometimes there's a growth gap that doesn't close completely over time. And what we want to do is use additional measures to try to reduce that growth gap. But on the fiscal side, you correctly understood me that I think that when we analyze the budget, we do not see a huge gap in returning to something like the pre-crisis levels. Now, let me clarify that by saying we would project that in the medium term, say 2025 or 2026, as the current measures have faded out because the pandemic is gone, that spending would go back to usual and revenues would rise with economic growth. And that would bring us to a position where the government budget deficit would be on the order of 0.5 to 1% of GDP. It's not quite the pre-crisis level, because if you will recall, immediately before the crisis, the government was running a surplus of around 1% of GDP. So we're talking about going from a surplus of 1% of GDP to maybe a deficit of 0.5 over the medium term, with the interim, of course, the large deficits that we see as a result of the crisis. What we would say is that a deficit of around 0.5 to 1% of GDP is an acceptable level from a macroeconomic perspective. And so there would be no need to go back to surplus. Of course, there could be a political decision that would be the desirable place to be, in which case some consolidation measures would be used. Now, why is it that we think that the fiscal path will revert to a very acceptable level over the medium term without major actions? There are several factors that play into this. The first is the huge component of the deficit that we have in 2020 and 2021 has to do with a drop in revenues due to the economic decline and a rise in spending for emergency support, health spending, short-time work scheme, direct payments to firms, et cetera, et cetera. And those measures we don't anticipate will last over time. So by 2022, 23, those measures will largely be gone and all that spending will go down. At the same time, with 3.5% growth this year and over 4% growth next year, we will see revenues recover quite well. So those two areas are going to sort of partially adjust themselves. The second contribution to this is the fact that the interest payments made by Austria are continuing to decline over time, even though the level of indebtedness is rising. Why is that? Well, that's because the interest rates are so extraordinarily low that the Austrian Treasury can finance itself at very close to zero rates in balance. Some of the issuances are even in negative territory. So that means that interest payments as a share of GDP will continue to drop over the medium term, even though the stock of debt is higher. So that saves you money in the medium term and helps you go back to a lower deficit. And then the final component of that is that the Austrian tax system does not index income tax rates to increasing inflation. And while inflation we expect will be quite low, there's an effect called bracket creep, where people gradually move into a higher income tax bracket and revenues come in additionally on an automatic basis. Now, that would be counteracted by tax cuts for the lower income brackets, which we are recommending. But without that, you would see an increase in income tax revenues coming there. So it's the three things. It's reversal of emergency spending and increase in revenues from the end of the crisis. It's lower interest payments, and it's increased income tax revenues over the medium term. Now, turning to your second question, what is the single most important measure needed? That's a really tough question, because it's not like Austria has one giant problem that impedes the activity of its economy. It's a very advanced and well-to-do economy, and it has a number of really small things that need to be done to kind of continue to be at the production frontier and among the wealthier countries in the world. But if I had to pick one, I think it would be the carbon pricing recommendation, with the associated reimbursement for the vulnerable populations and investment in green activities. I think that is the single biggest thing that could put Austria on track for meeting its climate change objectives. It would also facilitate a rapid greening of the economy, which could put Austria at the forefront of green technologies and provide opportunities for exporting skills and technology going forward. So if I had to pick one, it would be that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Franks. Mr. Governor, do you want to add something to that? No, okay. I have again a raised hand by Thomas Karabacek. Thomas?
I don't want to be peaky, but I have the impression there are not too many questions around, so I might take my chance if it's okay for you. If you say it's enough, it's enough, but if there's nobody else pushing forward.
No, go ahead.
Okay, fine. Then I have two questions, one again to you, Mr. Franks, and one to the governor. You have talked about the financial sector, I understand that well, but we do have a rather high debt level, stock of debt. Is that no problem at all for you, or do you envisage that it just stays high? And I understand that your calculations are with very low interest rate, but what if the interests do rise, which will come sooner or later? what then for Austria? And maybe I pose my question to Governor Holzmann. It is a rather simple question. Do you believe that the Austrian government is about to take these measures, is on a good way to act according to these recommendations?
Thank you. Let me address the first question then. I assume you're talking about the stock of debt for the public sector.
Yes.
The stock of the debt for the public sector is risen from the 70% of GDP level up to about 83% of GDP, and it will rise slightly in 2021 additionally. That is a number that is maybe sounds large in absolute terms, but is actually low by European standards, by advanced economy standards. So that's one reason why we're not so worried about it. The second reason why we're not so worried about it is as the deficit comes down for the reasons I already discussed, then the debt to GDP ratio will begin to decline, and it will decline quite sustainably from about 2023 onward. And so we think that the problem will sort of slowly rectify itself over time. It is true that precautions against possible increases in interest rates would be desirable. And here, the Austrian Treasury is already taking measures. By lengthening the maturity of the debt, they're locking in those low interest rates for a longer period of time, which will give the country more time to adjust if and when interest rates eventually rise. I think the final point I would say is that we in the IMF are anticipating that this low interest rate environment in the world, but particularly in Europe, will persist for at least 2 to 3 years to come, perhaps longer. And therefore, we don't see an immediate challenge from rising interest rates. Perhaps the final point on that is that Austria is classified with relatively good credit ratings from the credit rating agencies. It's perceived as a fiscally responsible country. And for that reason, interest rates should also remain low because the risk premium associated to Austrian debt is extraordinarily low. Let me turn it over to the governor for the second question.
Thanks a lot, and very interesting question. And I think the answer can be quite affirmative and building on what Mr. Chavez just said, Mr. Franks. And it has to do, before the crisis, the government was already at the level of having saved for a crisis. So before the crisis, debt has come down in quite some speed because with constant real expenditures, the growth has led to a decline in the debt GDP ratio into the range of the low 70s and would have been on the way to the 60s to the Maastricht criteria. So if the past development is a predictor for the future, this will be the right way to do. And I'm comforted with the recent letter which the Minister of Finance has written to his colleagues in Europe, asking them, how to say, to follow the example of after the crisis being more focused in the expenditures and doing this what is needed for a good anti-cyclical policies, saving good times to be able to spend in bad times. And I hope this will be taken up by many of his colleagues because this is a very simple mechanism, but a very effective one, as we have been seeing over recent years. The second part of it, and here Mr. Franks has very clearly hinted out what he considers as the single most important tax, which is the carbon tax. And as there's a government of a coalition with the Green Party, I understand that also the Green Party has the carbon tax as one of the main measures there. So if it is important walking the talk, if the carbon tax and including, and I think that's an important area, with border adjustment can be established, and this is a little bit of a European challenge, also within the European Union, I think we would be in a great shape in order to confront the needed mechanisms in the area of making the future greener and safer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Governor. I don't see a raised hand at the moment. That means there is no point of prolonging this press conference any longer, and we can conclude here. Mr. Franks, thank you very much for your elaborations, Mr. Governor. Thank you very much, and I thank the colleagues from the media for their participation and for the questions. And with that, we can conclude the press conference. Wish you a nice day in Washington, Mr. Franks, and for all of us in Vienna, good evening, and maybe we will see a good match at the European Championship. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Jeffrey,
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.